Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com. This is episode 319. And today's topic is probably a range of topics under the umbrella of resistance training, ultimately aimed at helping you improve your craft as a strength studio owner or practitioner, helping you improve your ability to train your clients and yourself. And today's guest to join me on this topic is Dr. James Fisher. James is a course leader and senior lecturer in sports conditioning and fitness at Southampton Solent University in the UK. He is regarded as one of the leading researchers in exercise science and in particular resistance training. He's been on the podcast tons of times, and I love having him back to talk about all things resistance training. Welcome back, James.
Lawrence, thank you very much for having me.
Good to have you back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely, mate. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk to you about, which obviously we've been discussing over Facebook leading up to this, was my episode with Bill DeSimone, episode 313, where we talked all about his book, Joint Friendly Fitness. And in that conversation, we talked about the lumbar extension, and we talked about Bill's thoughts around training the lower back, which was really interesting. And there were certainly some views of his that run contradictory to many of the people within high intensity training. So I'm interested in exploring this with you. But just to preface this conversation, to really, I guess, conclude what Bill was saying, and actually Bill expanded on this in an article after our podcast. And his kind of conclusion was, loading the spine into flexion is a bad idea. And that full kind of, when you're in full flexion, for example, in the MedX lumbar extension, that being loaded in that position is a bad idea. And his kind of thesis or justification for this is as follows, and I'm reading directly from his blog post, okay? So he said, there are no benefits to putting uneven stress on the discs, impinging and or herniating discs, irritating the nerves and overstretching the ligaments of the spine, impacting the facet joints, all of which happens when an external weight on your own effort forces your spine into the extremes of flexion and or extension. Now, let's just contrast that with what Dr. Ted Dreisinger said. So I've had Ted on my podcast numerous times. He's also done content in the membership. I wrote this PDF following some content he did in the membership with me. And I reread that today to kind of just remind myself what his view on this is. And he seems to run very contradictory to what Bill's saying. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to summarize what he was saying in the work we've done together to say. And what he said is loading the spine results in low impact on the actual spine itself, and forces are transferred to the muscle and facet joints. So there's low pressure on the discs. So that seems to almost run counter to what Bill is saying. And I know Bill is drawing from, I believe, a lot of the sort of biomechanics literature. So I'm a little bit confused here as to who's right. So I know that was a big lead up, James, but I don't know if that helps in terms of get us started.
Well, yeah, that's a great lead up, and I don't have a black and white answer to who's right. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a step back and say, first of all, I haven't read Bill's book. Bill has actually sent it me, and I have it right here in front of me. So absolutely, and it is a masterpiece. So much credit to Bill. I've always been a big fan of his work, and the primary thing that Bill does fantastically is he talks about strength training through a lifetime. He's one of his famous quotes, which I regurgitate to my students frequently, is what we do in our 20s, we pay for in our 40s. And he's absolutely right. There's no question about it. So Bill very much errs on the side of caution with everything and longevity. And he often talks about the fact that injuries and ailments in our body are seldom a product of an acute incident. They're a product of wear and tear that then might produce an acute incident, but it is more often just wear and tear. We've worn something down or we've misused it and so forth. So, and Bill's absolutely right with that. So the reality of all of this is only time will tell in the long term, in the big picture. Now, if I take a step back to what Bill said, what he's saying is we shouldn't load the spine in flexion. And this has been the physiotherapist's quote or the biomechanist's quote for as long as I can remember. And it's manual handling, right? I can remember in some of the jobs that I had being taken to one side and said, right, this is how you pick up a box. And I was like, right. And they were like, now demonstrate how and you're like, what the heck? This is like remedial, seriously. But they always said, lift with your legs, not with your back, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And that's fine. That's great. But it's almost been accepted wisdom for so long now that I feel like it's one of those things that we could really dig very, very deep into if we had the time. So where does this kind of concept originate from? And you introduced the segment there with Bill's statement, and there are some things there that I think make some sense depending on the position of our lumbar spine. But I know in context, we're going to talk about kind of the MedX lumbar extension machine.
Yeah.
So, and that, of course, is where Ted talks about. I guess I'm going to caveat everything that I say now by saying this is not necessarily when the spine is in flexion or in a neutral lumbar spine, so a natural lumbar curve. I'm going to say when using the MedX lumbar extension. So when we stress our low back with the position of the load, which is relatively high up the back, it's not against the low back, it's high up to create a lever, and we brace against it, or we lift against it, we push against it, we naturally will load the muscles in doing so. And it makes sense that by loading the muscles, we deload the skeleton. That's what we do in every other exercise. It doesn't make sense to say, well, if you do a squat, when you load the muscles, you also load the bones. Well, you do, but you essentially deload the bones in a certain way, and you create a moment at the origins and insertions and the point of attachment. And based on lumbar anatomy, where our muscles kind of originate low down and then insert quite a few vertebrae up, it's never sort of just over one vertebrae, it's over multiple vertebrae in a sequence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of.
so I don't necessarily agree that we're loading the skeleton and the facet joints specifically. I think you said about stretching the tendons there as well. Was that one of the statements that Bill made?
Yeah. So Bill's summary, and I really hope I'm not taking Bill out of context. I'm sure he'll be quick to correct us in the comments, and which I invite. I'm not. Yeah. This is not just to caveat what I'm about to say and what the rest of this conversation. I never care for personal attacks. So I value what Bill says enormously, and I love his work, and I've had him on the podcast loads of times. I just like learning, right? And I think it's healthy to challenge each other. So anyway, not that perhaps I didn't need to say that, but anyway. He would say. So what he said here is no benefits to putting uneven stress on the discs, impinging or herniating the disc, irritating the nerves, and overstretching the ligaments of the spine. Is that what you meant?
Yeah. So overstretching the ligaments of the spine. So I'm not convinced that that's said in a way that makes it sound like it's, really terrible, overstretching. Are we overstretching or are we just stretching? Because at every other joint, we want to stretch ligaments to make the joint mobile. So, when people have back pain, one of the most common things they do is they get out of bed and they stretch. So are they overstretching their joints in doing that? Because essentially they're using their mass, their upper body torso, as the resistance to provide stretch. Yeah,
and that's when they have the back pain. That's when
that's if they have back pain. So people look for lengthening a muscle to acutely reduce back pain. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that intent of stretching. I actually think that joints work particularly well based on mobility or stability. And in fact, one of the things that I teach my students, and I'm more than happy to kind of talk it through now, is if we work our way up from the sole of our feet, we should look at ankle mobility, knee stability, hip mobility, which is often where the problem first arises. And every successive joint has the contradictory kind of requirement. So hip mobility, lumbar stability. So we do want lumbar stability. And in Bill's book, he does sort of say one of the purposes of the lumbar spine is to provide mobility, to provide movement within a range of motion, but also to provide stability for our other limbs to provide movement. And I think this is where the muscles of our trunk are essential to provide a rigid core, which I know a lot of HIIT enthusiasts hate the word core, but to provide a rigid trunk from which movement to occur. And the phrase that I think was best put in one of the papers that I often cite to my students is it's proximal stability for distal mobility. So I want my trunk to be strong and potentially still for my arms and my hips and my legs to be able to move freely. And that I'm sure Bill would agree with that. Although if he doesn't, then of course he can comment. Now I think that the key thing here is how we then train the muscles of the trunk, and there is definitely an argument for training for that stability. So we look at a lot of spinal stability exercises, things like the plank, things like a bird dog, and so forth, where we train the trunk in a very rigid way. We train our rectus abdominis, our rectus spinae, our internal, external obliques. We train maybe our diaphragm and our pelvic floor as well, and our transverse
during a plank.
abdominis. Yeah, during a plank. Yeah. We should kind of contract everything in, and the coaching point that I would typically use is like a brace and breathe. So we should brace everything, but we should still be able to kind of breathe within it. So
brace, that does that can you also describe that as like contracting your trunk, your abdominals, whilst maintaining that rhythmic breathing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just my own understanding.
Yeah. But I also think that we can train our muscles through the movement that we want them to perform. And at some point we are going to want to perform spinal flexion and spinal extension and lateral flexion. And certainly the evidence suggests that low back pain is very strongly correlated with lumbar weakness. Now, if we had people with sort of abdominal pain, then which would probably be more a product of organs or so forth, we would probably advise training the abdominal muscles. So it stands to reason that if a muscle is weak, or if we identify that a muscle is weak in relation to the rest of the body, then it should be trained as such. And we do know that the lumbar muscles are weak, even in very, very strong people. So, one of our PhD students who actually submitted his thesis this week, he had previously looked at some powerlifters and strongmen, and looking at incredibly strong athletes who can, squat and deadlift, incredible loads, had a low back strength tested on the lumbar extension of not much more than, a normal trained male. And so their ability to...
Do you happen to remember like the weights they were able to lift and for what repetitions? I know it's hard to probably remember that.
I think off the top of my head, some of the squats were around 260, 300 kilos. So,
what they were able to do on the lumbar though,
on the lumbar, they were somewhere, it was pretty broad standard deviation, I would say. As a range, it was probably somewhere full flexion between 270 and 500 Newton meters, which is not incredibly strong at all in full flexion. So what that sort of suggests is that the bracing that they produce when they do a squat or a deadlift movement isn't necessarily strengthening the lumbar extensors beyond a certain point. Now, they might not need it, and that's absolutely fine. But they also all reported low back pain at some point in their life. Now, that might be a product of the heavy lifting that they do and of other things. And, correlation is not causation. We can't ever say that because they did this, it equals that. But one of the things that I would be more interested to find out, and one of the things that we've shown previously, is that strengthening the lumbar extensors improves your deadlift strength. So, to me, it stands to reason that we need to have strength in these muscles. Everybody does, but the more we lift, the more strength we need. People with back pain are weak. If strengthening the muscles reduces back pain, then that's an avenue to go down. I don't think putting somebody into a flexed position where we're stretching them is necessarily overstretching them. I think we can overstretch them, but I think this is where client care is really important. And hit practitioners probably sit somewhere along a spectrum where they're either very, very cautious with everybody they work with, or they are on the side of caution with everybody they work with, which might be the kind of Builder-Simone extreme, or they might be, focus more so on intensity and less on other factors. But remember that that's within high intensity training. If you put high intensity training in context of everybody else, high intensity training is at the very, very safe end of the spectrum.
Even the unsafe, well, quote unquote unsafe in here is like the safe of the overall.
I would much rather be trained by the unsafest HIIT practitioner than anybody further outside of that.
Totally.
So I think that we can step a bit too far with this. Now the question might be, do we need to move too far? So, Bill raised the issue of working through a limited range of motion, and that was a great point, because if we don't need to work through a full range of motion, then why bother? And there's a lot of evidence around limited range of motion training showing similar adaptations. Bill and I have had this conversation before, and I tend to think that limiting the range of motion of a movement is probably not a bad thing in many participants. I tend to think we can be too constrained by that. We can say, oh, there's too much happening, let's limit the range of motion. Maybe we can coach people out of that movement, maybe with the right, maybe with a different exercise for that person. We don't need to worry about what else is happening. So a prime example here is a pullover exercise. So I absolutely love the Nautilus or the MedX pullover machine. James Steele really dislikes it because of his shoulder mobility. So his shoulder mobility would probably mean that past a certain point, he gets quite an arch in his lumbar spine, in his thoracic spine, and a lot of the movement comes from here without ever happening here. Well, for James, that's just clearly not a good movement for him, maybe based on his biomechanics or his skeletal system, and maybe the best way with
shoulder injury too, right?
And shoulder injuries, yeah. And maybe the best thing with that is to limit the range of motion. So he only ever does a pullover in this range of motion, and that would be fine. Mike Petrella often talks about how he is a huge advocate of the Nautilus pullover because of the way it was designed around Kim Wood, and he's of a similar stature, and it always just works perfectly for him. So I definitely think that there's a lot in what Bill is saying, and in fact, what I'm even going to go further to say is HIIT practitioners are most often criticized for a lack of personal training. They kind of take a one-size-fits-all. They kind of take here's my 12 exercise workout, everybody does it. And the criticism is that's not personal. Well, they're absolutely right. It's a fair comment. It's not individualized. So maybe with certain individualized, we should be cautious about the range of motion people work through. Maybe if you have Mike Petrella's facility with 100 plus resistance machines, you choose X leg press over Y leg press. You choose this row compared to that chest press, or whatever it might be. So, I think that the biomechanics of movement, of loading, the muscular system, of range of motion is fascinating. I think we can be too. We can take I think it's wrong to take a blanket approach to say don't load the spine in flexion. I think that's just something that's been thrown around for so long that we need to look at in a bit more detail than that. We need to look at the client. We need to look at the machine being used and so forth. You mentioned to me a while back about I'm trying to think of what the exercise was, a type of deadlift where you allow the spine into flexion and then kind of unravel the spine, as it were, and extend it. And I said I would never do that. Now, based on the loading of it, I would feel out of control in that because of where the load is, pulling against my shoulders and my upper spine as well. Well, if I can control my upper back, much like you can do in the MedX lumbar extension, then I feel much more comfortable doing a strict lumbar extension exercise. So again, I think we just have to look at that kind of the way it's applied. There was a paper came out actually the month you did the podcast with Bill, and it came out afterwards. So there was no chance Bill could have read it, but it looked at exactly that. It looked at loading the spine in a lifting movement with a straight back, with a slightly flexed back, and with a flexed back as far as people want to flex it. And they found that people were stronger with a flexed spine, and they reported, based on kind of models and EMG and movement at other joints, greater neuromuscular efficiency of the spine, of the muscles of the spine. So I think that there's a lot to be said here to kind of say, actually, it's maybe okay to flex the spine. It just depends how we do it. Now, that was an acute study. That was okay, if we lift in this position compared to if we lift in this position. And the counter argument to that, which is completely fair, is, yeah, but if you lift in this position for 20 years compared to if you lift in this position for 20 years. So, we're dealing with a very, very big gray area, and there are shades of gray. There are other shades within it. So I just, when we've spoken about this since Bill's podcast, I think that we can't be as black and white as to say we don't load the spine in flexion. And Bill was very gracious in what he said about when we train people on the MedX, we give them great coaching cues and so forth. So I really,
I was like, no, I've seen James and James put people into flexion. They put me into flexion.
Yeah. But I think that, coming back to Ted Dreisinger, he's absolutely right. If we want to train those muscles, we probably, the evidence says the best way to do it is to move them through their range of motion, a shortening and lengthening rather than an isometric action, which requires flexing and extending the lumbar spine. And that's it as far as I'm concerned. I think that's the best way to do it. It's how we do that. That's the big question.
And just let me make sure I understand this. So when you say how, I mean, you prefaced all of this by saying, I'm saying everything in the context of the MedX lumbar extension. So if you're flexing the spine under load in that machine and you're coaching it very well, your slow speed of movement, smooth turnarounds, then you wouldn't be necessarily that concerned with most individuals going into full flexion.
With their full flexion, yeah. Bearing in mind, most people mechanically will not have the same degree of flexion in their spine. Yeah. Now, in the early research, there was talk of you should have 72 degrees range of motion in the lumbar spine from full flexion to full extension. But not everybody's going to have that naturally. So, in the same way, not everybody has the same range of motion at the joint or the shoulder or the hip and so forth. So, and that's not a product of muscle tightness, it's a product of anatomy. So I think that we shouldn't look at somebody that's got 60 degrees range of motion and say, well, let's try and stretch you that bit further. We can say, let's get you into a position where the muscle is being stretched, where it's under load, but not let's stretch you further and further and further and further. This isn't, gymnastics, high school gymnastics where the teacher leans on somebody to make them do the splits. That is definitely bad.
When you put someone in the lumbar, when you first have them in and you're trying to figure out their range of motion, what do you say? How do you do it? Because I'm just curious, because I have a way I do it, but I'd love to know how you do it. How do you figure out someone's ideal range of motion?
Yeah, so with the medical, it's probably a bit different from with the exercise machine. So we have a movement arm that can lock in every 3 degrees. Once they're seated in the machine with the pad in the right place, their femur is aligned with the seat pad. Different restraints, the hip belt, the knee pad, and the footboard are tightened up to restrain them. Excuse me. I would then ask them to come forward as far as they can. They have a hand position up here, so their back is already naturally in a scapular retracted position, which is pretty similar to the exercise device as well. There's a neck pad here, which they're encouraged never to push into, but always to stay in contact with. So they've got great upper body posture, first off. And we then tell them to lean forward, maintaining that posture. At the point where they reach, I then generally, if they haven't reached full range of motion, apply a little bit of pressure and ask them if they are if they're comfortable with that, and normally look for a further 3 degrees so that they're loaded at the position they reached. Because what most people do is they go, I can get to there, but they're pulling the device down, and especially if they're pulling the counterweight down, they need sort of some resistance to help them come down. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
So, but we work within the margins of the client that we've got within the part, and within their history. So if they have got back pain, we're probably way more cautious with them. Partly because of their confidence of being in the machine, of training those muscles, and so forth. So it's certainly not a one size fits all approach. Every client is different. Every participant is different. And the way we talk to them and the way we approach it, we have kind of standard things that we would say about their setup, about where they look, about maintaining posture. But we also would talk to them based on who they are. If they've got good training background and so forth, or if they haven't got a training history and back pain, then that's different. So,
it's really common, obviously, to come across clients who've had back issues, back injuries, that kind of thing, maybe even back surgery. And would you still look to train someone with a full range of motion, despite that, if they had full range of motion? So you'd still look to get the greatest range of motion you could, so long as it wasn't uncomfortable or painful for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can get in. So bear in mind, I've never had back pain. I've never had back surgery or anything like that. But when I get in the lumbar extension machine, I can lean right forward, hold the handles, pull it right forward to 72 degrees, and I could rest there and stay there and feel quite comfortable with it there. So that's naturally my range of motion, and arguably beyond that. So when I'm loaded, when I'm lifting a resistance, I can almost deload it by letting the weight stack touch and rest at the bottom rather than feeling a stretch. So for example, for me, that's absolutely fine. It's not a problem at all. With other people, you work within the range of motion that they can move within. And I would, if their range of motion naturally increases as their back pain decreases, which we see very, very often, and a part of that is the confidence in the machine as well, then I would encourage the range of motion to be increased within the capabilities of the participant.
Because there's potentially greater benefits, as you described in that recent study, if they can do.
Well, I think that we should train a muscle through as full a range of motion as is safe to do with that participant. So I don't think we should unnecessarily reduce the range of motion. I definitely think there are cases where we should reduce the range of motion, but I think that where we can do a full range of motion, we should do so.
What were the signs would be for you for limiting that range of motion? Would it be like if they've got some kind of pain, or like, can you describe like the type of cases where you would do that?
Well, if they can't retain good posture through the rest of their torso, that's one of the first. So if they simply can't retain good upper body posture, then that's an issue. If there's any pain or any discomfort that's not a muscular level, which is very difficult for some people to express, although they will express that it hurts.
Especially on the lumbar, right? Because the lumbar is a strange sensation. Like when you say to someone, try and make that distinction between muscular discomfort and stabbing pain. Like, I don't know what you think, but I just feel like when you're at muscle failure on the lumbar, it is a really different sensation in muscle failure on other machines, I find. And it's hard to articulate.
Yeah, but I think that one of the things that we find with people with low back pain, and bear in mind, we've got studies where over 10 weeks people have improved their strength by 200%. Now that's a phenomenal amount. But I would critique my own studies by saying they didn't improve their strength by 200%. They improved their strength and they improved their confidence in producing maximal force. So if you take somebody that's got low back pain and you test them and test them and test them, they're going to give you what they're prepared to give you as far as their confidence will take them. Once they're confident in a machine and they're competent in the movement and competent in pressing against the pad, their strength has certainly increased. Their neuromuscular efficiency has certainly increased. Their recruitment, their rate coding, all of the things that are kind of neurophysiological adaptations to strength training have improved. There's no question about that. But now they also know this machine isn't going to kill me and it isn't going to hurt me. So now I know I can kind of really push against it. So there's definitely an element of that. But that's what strength training is, because if somebody isn't prepared to contract their muscle because of pain or because of anxiety, then isn't part of personal training to reduce the anxiety so that they can contract their muscle.
So, yeah, so true. I hear so many cases of what you say, and I've had it myself with clients who weren't confident on it. And that's usually because they've had some kind of issue with it or injury. And it's so funny. I had one client who's a very strong client. This is the cycling client, actually, who might even listen to this podcast. Who I'm trying to recall. I think, yeah, he did something like, I don't know, I want to say, let's say 14 reps at a given load, and then I increased the load by, I don't know, 10%, and then he did like 25 reps the following week, because he was like, okay, I can do this. This is safe. And that confidence had improved. So that was really, really interesting to see. Really cool to see, actually.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. And I was on the lumbar today, actually, James. And we'll talk about this probably in a bit in terms of our training, but I was on the lumbar today. Sort of, I don't know, I did probably about 9 or 10 exercises, and it was probably my 6th or 7th. And I did exactly what you said. So I don't use a lot of load on the lumbar because I'm really trying to just perfect my form on it and trying to really just gradually make it more difficult. And, as I'm coming down into flexion, I am, like you say, like allowing the weight stack to like touch for a second, and then really slowly coming back. So I'm really trying to just because I don't know, I just feel like it's one of those machines that you really want to be careful with form, right? And make sure that you're training safely. And I use actually a lot, in some cases, less resistance than my clients do, because I think my form is better, right? And I obviously when I work with clients, I try and coach the best form I can, but sometimes I feel like I can only get it to a certain level of excellence, shall we say. So anyway, that's just my way of saying, like, I'm using a relative, very moderate load. I think it's 180 pounds, something like that. So it's not a lot. But anyway, that's just something I was doing today. So
yeah, I definitely think that there's a big argument for slowing down repetitions, for creating a mind-muscle connection to train a muscle rather than just increasing the load. And I think that that's something that hip practitioners do a great job of. But could maybe do a better job of, or be more cautious with things like the lumbar. Notably, people with the lumbar, we have our medical lumbar extension right next to our medical knee extension, and with most people on the medical knee extension, we have to reiterate slowing down the rep duration and controlling the load all the way through and eliminating momentum and so forth. And we need to give those constant coaching points. We need to do it far, far less on the lumbar extension. People are very conscious of this movement, of there being a stopper at the back, and the need to kind of move very carefully through the range of motion. And I often laugh when we've got students who are doing some research using the medical lumbar extension, and then myself or Dr. James Steele will periodically kind of go, oh, well, while you're in here, could you put me through a quick, lumbar workout? Because the medical requires a trainer to strap you in properly. And they sort of say, yeah, okay, so we're going to do a 2-4 or a 4-4 rep duration. And we find that our reps are probably far closer to 10-second concentric and 10 seconds or more eccentric. And I don't use that rep duration for everything else that I do. But with the lumbar, I typically move a lot slower and a lot more deliberate, a lot more controlled. So, maybe there's a case for using different rep durations for this machine as well, and using that as a way to decrease the load, trying to create a mind-muscle connection and so forth.
Yeah, because you got me thinking, because there's a couple of clients training at the moment who they're on too high load really, and I have to try and have them keep to a 5.5. But the funny thing is because they're on a high load, they're not going to be able to stick to a challenging cadence, right? Because they want to use momentum to get to push that load through, right? So in order to get to that 10-10 or to test that out, I'd have to reduce their load, and they're fine with that because they understand what I'm trying to achieve with them. But let me ask you this, actually. Is there any, because obviously to expand on what I just said, like I've got clients who are using a relatively heavy load on the lumbar, and when they're doing the concentric, I might be able to really get them to smoothly turn around at the bottom, but they will kind of throw themselves back. And I'm always trying to tell them to slow down and not do that. Is there any potential risks in throwing themselves back like that? I mean, I say throw is maybe a strong word, but you know what I mean? It's like it's sometimes probably a 2-second concentric on the lumbar. I'm just concerned about that.
2-second concentric is still a controlled rep duration. The lumbar is actually quite a large range of motion. It's interesting when people talk about using a certain rep duration consistently across all exercises, because if you do a 10-10 rep duration for a pullover, that's probably a pretty reasonable pace because it's such a large range of movement. It's something like 270 degrees. If you do a 10-10 rep duration for hip abduction, that'll feel incredibly slow, or for a shrug, that'll feel incredibly slow because of the range of motion that you're moving through. Now, the lumbar is actually quite a big range of movement. So I think 2 seconds is to me, when I see people doing 2-second concentric, I often think it looks fast, but I know that they're controlling the weight. So I don't stress over it too much. I panic more when they build up speed as they go through and hit that stopper at the end. Do I think that that's bad? Yeah, I think there's probably a high risk of injury because it's like a car accident, right? Push, stop. We don't want that to happen. So I would tend to slow it down a bit more than that. I'm conscious of that when I exercise. So I definitely think it's a machine where a slow turnaround at the bottom is really important. People will often kind of exhale and throw themselves back. So I think a smooth turnaround is key.
Yeah, awesome. That's given me a lot to think about and experiment with. There's one other thing I want to mention. It's interesting what you say. Going back to your point about, this might not be, to support Bill's case, it might not be an acute problem, but could be something that manifests itself later on in life, potentially. And it's interesting because I think the only way to really know this, in my opinion, is to look at shops that do thousands of workouts every week. And obviously there's a few of those now around the world, and who use the lumbar every week in those workouts, and then see how those clients fare over the long term. And maybe even that's not going to be that revealing, but I figured, you've got some of these shops have been operating for 15, 20 years. I don't know many that have been operating longer than that are doing that scale of workout.
It's interesting. I think you could probably find enough people who have used the MedX lumbar extension for long enough because of how long it's been around.
So you could survey it potentially.
To survey whether they've developed back pain or had issues as a result of it. I know. I often laugh with Luke. He often tells me what Jim Flanagan lifts on the lumbar extension, and Jim has probably been training on it for as long as anybody else. And is incredibly strong on the MedX lumbar extension. Is also potentially a little bit biased towards how good the machine is, because of his affiliation with MedX. But I mean, we've had ours since 2007, so I've probably put 14 years in on our lumbar extension, and not, and I'm now 42, so I've been training on it since I was 28. We had one at Chester, the university I was at before that, for a couple of years. So I've probably done 15 plus years training on a MedX lumbar extension and not experienced back pain as a result of it. So I think that there's cases for its use. Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't contradictory cases to say over the long term, but I can imagine that based on the machine, based on the population group that use it, it's probably very well looked after. So.
Yeah, awesome, cool. So you said it wasn't going to take long, but that was almost an hour on the lumbar.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I thought that was great, and like, no problem. We got obviously a little bit more time, so I figured let's see what else we have here. Well, let me ask you: is there anything else that you remember listening to the episode that you wanted to talk about specifically, or do you want me to see what else I got here?
Not from that episode, I don't. I remember listening to Bill, and like I said, I've got huge respect for Bill and his knowledge and his experience, and really value everything that he writes. And I really value his opinion. He said that, and it made me think, wow, we need to go back and look at this. Are there reasons we should do this? Should we limit range of motion? It's good to be challenged. It's right to have those people around you or in your group. So, I really, really value what you said. So.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. There's, oh God, I know this is probably going to be a longer than a 15-minute chat, but maybe we can keep it short. Last time we spoke, you and I did a series with Luke, which I love doing that series. I'm going to be re-listening to that so much. And I've had really good feedback on it. So I really appreciate you doing that. But one of the things you mentioned on that, and we've talked about, I believe, in membership content as well, is Brad's study on the conclusion that was basically that, for maximizing muscle hypertrophy, you want to be looking at 9 sets per muscle. Was it per muscle group or per muscle per week?
Yeah, per muscle group per week. Yeah.
Now, when you cite that, I always feel like you're reluctantly agreeing with it, right? Correct if I'm wrong. Just with your tone, and look, this is where my recall is obviously terrible, because I know that you and I have talked about this before on membership content and maybe even on the public podcast, and you gave your whole kind of view on that research, and let me just tell you what I think, and then I'd just love to hear your thoughts. So. The problem with that research, and again, I know I could just look at the paper, but I just want to have a conversation with you about this, is from memory, it seemed to me that the justification for that volume is based on a significant gain that wasn't necessarily justified to be a meaningful, significant gain. Maybe it's a couple of percentage points, but would you really see it on an individual in terms of increased muscle mass? And then there might have been perhaps potentially some measurement issues in that study. So I just wanted to revisit that for a moment with you. I don't know if you recall that study in detail, because I don't recall. Skeptical. Yeah.
I don't recall the study in detail, but I can give you my 2 strongest counter arguments against it. And they're slightly different in what they are. So the first of which is when we measure muscle size in a scientific study like ultrasound, we measure it using a very objective measure. So we place a probe against the skin, we disregard subcutaneous fat, and we take literally a measurement of the thickness of the muscle. Okay. So Lawrence, if you came into me on day 1 and I measured your bicep or quad thickness, or I don't know, hamstring or whatever it might be, thickness, and after 10 weeks, I say to you, you've had an increase of, I don't know, 5 mil. Okay. So, and it's statistically significant. And so therefore this training protocol is better than that training protocol where you only had an increase of 2 mil. Well, that's great. Objectively, those numbers stack up and everything's great. What that doesn't tell you is what's meaningful to you when you look in the mirror. So one of the things that I would constantly argue is all these objective measures are fantastic, but they don't necessarily mean anything when we look in the mirror. I laugh with one of my PhD students because he often says to me, wow, you're looking big. And I laugh because He says it because he's one of my PhD students and I'm a supervisor. But what he actually is seeing is that I'm leaner. And one of the best ways to look bigger, to look more muscular, is to be leaner. Okay. So the key with all of this is that it's not what we see when we look in the mirror. What people see when they look at us is probably far, far different than what an objective measure actually tells us. So I think there's probably a very poor relationship between change in muscle size measured objectively by things like ultrasound or even DEXA or CT scan or anything like that, and certainly by biopsy, because biopsy is at a fibrillar level, which probably doesn't translate very well to whole muscle change anyway. You can see like a 13% change at a muscle fiber size, and that will correspond to maybe a 2 to 5% change in whole muscle size because of fiber packing density and maybe change in pennation angle and other sort of morphological characteristics. So the first thing that I would say is any differences in volume are probably so low that they're not visually discernible anyway, although that's probably true of muscle size changes anyway. Now, that's not to say that they're wrong. But my other argument against all of this would be that we know that the muscle size is going to plateau. And if I put somebody through a 12-week training study and a multiple set group finishes here after 12 weeks and a single set group finishes here after 12 weeks, that's not to tell me how they're going to continue adapting beyond that. So all we know is in this time scale, this is the adaptations we can expect. Now, if somebody says to me, I'm in a rush to put on as much muscle as I can in the next 10 or 12 weeks, then at that point, I might say, okay, we're going to do this. And there might be a case for greater volume in the training program. But for the sake of longevity and for the sake of time efficiency, if we were to expand that over 20 weeks, we don't know whether both groups would have seen the same adaptation. If we expand that over a year, it's almost certain that both groups would have seen the same adaptation. I cannot imagine that those data points at this far apart would have carried on getting further and further apart. I think they would have probably got closer and closer and closer. And ultimately, we've got a genetic potential any way we look at it. So even if multiple set training gets you there quicker, it only gets you there quicker. It doesn't get you more. So it's more likely that all of these outcomes are a product of the limited duration of training. Now, I know that people will say you can continue increasing muscle size, you can continue increasing muscle mass. You haven't got a genetic potential, you can break through that, and so forth. I disagree. I think that we've got a point where we're just simply not going to grow anymore. Our body isn't going to put any more energy into making our muscles any bigger or any stronger, and increasing in muscle size. So no matter what we do.
I love it. That was so perfectly put. Such a great argument. Both arguments. I just wanted to say one more thing on that is, actually, that didn't take that long, actually. I thought we were going to be on that for a lot longer. It is, that at the end of the day, as you've explained this before in previous content, is 9 sets per muscle per week is still relatively low volume, especially when you compare it to that whole spectrum of health and fitness we were talking about earlier. It's nothing really, right? Yeah. And so do you still think there's a pretty strong argument, for us to look to replicate that kind of volume in our training services so as to maximize muscle size? And because obviously beyond hypertrophy, there are other benefits to having more muscle on your body. So you still think that should be, an aim for a lot of us?
So
I know that depends on preference, but go ahead.
So I find it really interesting, and my own workouts kind of fluctuate based on where my mind is at given times. I think there's an argument for training more frequently because of what that does to our metabolism. So I, if somebody had the capacity to do a very, very low volume workout, 2 or 3 exercises and train more frequently, 3 to 4 times a week, I could see the merits of that. If that meant that somebody did a split routine, I can see the merits of that. Because of boosting the metabolism for energy consumption and so forth. The flip side of that is it's not very time efficient. Our body doesn't rest in split ways. So why bother? We still need to rest between workouts anyway. Why not just get it all done in one day and do one big workout and then rest for a few days and do it again, or one bigger workout and do it all again? I think that we can take a scientific approach to training. So we know what the drivers are for muscle strength and muscle size. So we know that there's mechanical tension. We know that we need to have the tension, the muscle and the tension. We need to have a reasonable load to do that, to put the muscle in the tension. I think that allows us to incorporate some heavyweight training, some high loads, as well as some low loads at certain times. It might incorporate the use of advanced training techniques like heavy eccentrics, as was demonstrated by Mike at STG with their recent sort of Colorado experiment. Very heavy eccentric training will absolutely optimize mechanical tension. We know that one of the other drivers for muscle hypertrophy is metabolic stress, so a buildup of metabolites within the muscle. Now that can be a product of energy production, which might happen sufficiently over a single set to failure if a set has sufficient number of repetitions, or we might perform a sufficient number of sets to produce that. A big problem with the single multiple set debate, not to keep going on about it, is that a lot of the training protocols don't optimize metabolic stress. So a single set that's done at 1 second or 2 second concentric, 1 second, 2 second eccentric, and has 8 or 10 repetitions is, 20, 30 seconds maybe at the most. Let's say 40 seconds at the most. And I don't think that's sufficient to optimize metabolic stress unless you do 4 or 5 different exercises in a workout and then repeat that again another time per week. And none of the studies have really done that. Now, if you then repeat that to 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets, 6 sets, you probably do produce enough metabolites in the muscle to increase hypertrophy to a greater degree. And therefore, we start to see that disparity between single and multiple set training. So I think that what we can do is we're smart enough now to look at what are we trying to achieve by the workout that we're doing. If we're using a heavy load, we're definitely optimizing mechanical tension. If we're using a light load, it's probably more important that we get to failure. In fact, it's definitely more important that we get to failure, because that way we're optimizing motor unit recruitment as well as metabolic stress. So I think that we can manipulate the loads, manipulate the exercises, the number of exercises, the advanced techniques like drop sets. We can optimize both by doing a drop set. You can use a very heavy load for 3 or 4 reps, drop the load, do more reps, drop the load, do more reps. If your total time of the tension there is greater than 2 minutes, you've probably, ticked all boxes. So I think that there's a lot more in that we can kind of look at in our program design. That's
so cool. So you're reminding me of Doug described this on a podcast before to me about milking different aspects of the stimulus, right?
Yeah.
So if you cycle through a training program over the long term, which utilizes these different variables, then maybe you're going to get a little bit more out of your training.
Yeah, maybe so. Or you're going to at least optimize your training. Going back to the duration that I mentioned a minute ago about all the studies were limited by 12 weeks. There are some great studies that have looked at, one was 12 weeks, one was 15 weeks. And they did, one group did continued training throughout the protocol, and one group did 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And, most people look at that and say, or without looking at the data, and say, well, if you took a week off every 3 weeks, you definitely wouldn't make the same adaptations you would if you just carried on training. And yet the end results are absolutely identical. And all that happened is the group that did 3 weeks of training followed the same line as the group that did 12 weeks, but then dropped for a week and then spiked, and then dropped for a week and then spiked. Whereas the other group made a far more consistent increase. So after 12 weeks and after 15 weeks, and there may have been another one actually that was close to 21 weeks, they all showed the same training response. So we know that even taking breaks in your training every few weeks is really not going to harm your adaptations. So, and this is where we've got to look at the bigger picture. So, and this is not a dig at Brad or James Krieger or Brett or any of those guys who talk about volume, because I definitely think that they're onto something. I think that there probably is something in volume as a driver for metabolic stress and for muscle growth. But I think that we're hindered by the duration of the studies that exist, as well as other variables. So,
yeah. And I remember, I think you pulled that. You remind me of isn't that the presentation you did at Rec? One, maybe the last Rec, not the last virtual, but the last in-person one. I know there's so many.
there were a lot.
There was, well, maybe it was that paper, but you're basically, I think one of your kind of argument was, it really doesn't matter what frequency you do, it all kind of ends up at the same place.
Yeah, I tend to think it does. I tend to think it does. And this is where, as scientists way better than me have said, the best workout is the workout people will do. If people want to do a high volume and they can sustain it, then I'm go do it. That's fine. If people want to do a low volume or a low frequency or both, train once a week, train once a fortnight, and that's what they can sustain, do it. You will probably, over the big picture, over a lifetime, over 10 years, 5 years, whatever, you'll probably end up at a pretty similar point than you would have done following any other training protocol.
So just a few more minutes, I want to touch on, I guess, my own experiences and sort of like compare that against your own, because I'm quite interested. So I've been through, I would say, probably the most stressful year of my life. Having my first child, and obviously going through the pandemic and trying to run businesses through that, and experiencing lockdown and not being able to see family, and additional relationship stress and all the rest of it. And what I found is, so I increased my workout frequency to twice a week, and I was training once in the studio, full body, about 10 to 13 exercises, and then I would do a home workout. And the reason I did two different workouts is because I do virtual workouts with people, and I always want to maintain that discipline so I can practice and experience what it's like to be doing more body weight and more kind of like simpler stuff. Anyway, so the home workout is like, again, 10 to 13 exercises, lots of compound movements mostly, and then single joint stuff. And I just found like doing 2 a week was just too much. Like for a few reasons. One, thinking about Good to Go, that book we talked about recently, my morning mood was not great, right? Consistently not great. and obviously there's a number of variables to put that down to, right? Like being, having poor sleep, some sleep deprivation related to the baby, and stress and various other things, diet maybe. But it was quite consistent. And then also I noticed my intensity really started to drop off. So I really struggled to go to true muscle failure or to train as hard as I can. I know I can on certain exercises, especially the leg press. I really struggled to get there with the leg press, and same with some other exercises. And so what I've recently started doing is doing a split routine again. So doing upper body and upper lower body split, and almost having, due to just my busy schedule at the moment, almost having like a week between them. So that's pretty radical reduction in volume. But what I'm noticing is my intensity is through the roof. Like I'm able to push a lot harder. And I'm thinking that being the most important variable, maybe that's right. That's more productive for me. And then you've also got to factor in just the number of variables that are impacting my recovery. So my own genetics, I sometimes wonder if I am someone who does better with less, versus perhaps someone like you or Luke, who maybe seem to do better with more. That's just a theory, right? Maybe I'm wrong about that. And then it's just my current life context, right? It's just the fact that I'm in a very stressful period of my life where, when I compare my life currently to what it was like before Arthur came along is ridiculous. Like I had such low stress before, and I'm not complaining, by the way. I'm very happy with our decisions, but I'd be lying if I say it wasn't stressful. So anyway, I just want to share that with you because that seems to be what's working for me at the moment. And for me, like I don't want to train if I feel like crap all the time. I just can't. I just don't see the point. I think you've got to wake up in the morning feeling good, feeling optimistic, feeling ready to go. And I don't want to feel what's the word? Just low or pessimistic or not motivated. I mean, these just things aren't good, right? So anyway, I wanted to kind of parallel that against maybe what you've been through, because I know obviously you had after your son earlier than me, but did you go through a similar thing in terms of like your workouts change? And anyway, I know that was really long, but I just wanted to share that with you.
Lawrence, I know I completely empathize with everything you just said, and it's not something that's finished. I think life stresses exist and they happen, and we are victims of them, and we're victims of convenience as well. So we never want to train when we're fatigued, and we never want to train when we're not 100%. And we have to make a choice whether we get in and we just get on with it and we deal with the best we can, or whether we kind of say, okay, I'm going to skip it and I might not get to train for another 3 or 4 days, but that's okay. I can remember, Luke visiting the UK a few years back and having a migraine on one of the days that we were going to train, or the day that we were going to train, and he was absolutely devastated because convenience meant that we were going to train that day, and yet he was like there with this migraine, saying, "I can't do it." And in the end, we got about 3 or 4 exercises into the workout, and Luke said, "I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to get on with it," because he wanted to do it. And I'm sure Luke would say he gave it everything he could on that day, but what he had on that day was not what he would have had on any other given day. So I think that we have to look at this 2 ways. First of all, these stresses exist. We have to optimize them in a way that we can. So, for example, in the last, in the happy hour when we spoke the other week, I was wearing the blue light blocking glasses. Now I sleep. We moved house recently. We're in based on our new house layout where my son's room is. We have a light in the landing, and it kind of shines into our room. And I hate that. I would have like blackout blinds and everything else. My wife would sleep with a discotheque next to her, and it would drive me insane. It would just keep me up all night. So that's not optimized for me, but that's my life. I can't tick all the boxes that I want. I've got to pick my battles with that kind of thing, or do what I can in other ways. And there are days that I get up and I feel groggy, or I feel like I don't want to train, or I still maybe feel sore, and I have to deal with that. Either, okay, well, look, you can train today and you can make the best of it. You can adapt the workout based on how you feel. So reduce the volume, or, decrease the load, or increase the load so it's more brief, or whatever it might be. Or you can say, well, if I don't train today, I might not get to train for 3 or 4 more days at best. And you deal with that. And I think that's just something we all have to kind of live with and get on with. And it doesn't ever really change because these stresses happen. I've got I put on a pot of coffee in the morning, and it takes me 2 to 3 cups of coffee before I'm any good to anybody. And that's not like, I'm well aware that that's not good for you. That's too much.
Well, you're looking good, mate. All things considered, like you look really well.
Well, it's because I shaved off the beard.
I was just thinking your age. I was like, you don't look 42. You could pass for probably early 30s, honestly.
Well, I appreciate it. I think that we have to make changes as we go, and we do things on the fly. And my own workouts have changed. Back when we did some of those podcasts, I was talking about doing a 17 exercise workout. And if you remember that, because I got a lot of emails, I got a lot of messages saying, really, 17 exercises. This is the complete opposite to what you've talked about previously. And I would reply to them all and justify why I'm doing what I'm doing. If you look at my workouts now, I'm also doing an upper lower split. There's probably about 6 or 7 exercises each. And my lower split is lower and trunk muscles. So it's not even 7 or 8 lower body exercises. It's about 4 lower body exercises, maybe 5 lower body exercises, and then 2 or 3 trunk based exercises. And my upper body exercises we'll finish with, shrugs and biceps and triceps. So finish with kind of what I would call, peripheral or supplementary exercises. So, and that's partly because, as I said would happen, I've started cycling more. The weather's got better. I'm out on the bike more. When I go and do 60 miles on a Monday, I am not going to go back in the gym and do a leg workout on a Tuesday. I'm going to give it a few days and then do a leg workout. But yeah, I could do an upper workout on the Sunday or on the Tuesday and feel fine. So, and hence why I've split my workout down. I also knew, and I openly said back then, that a 17 exercise workout twice a week was never going to be sustainable over the long period. It was something that I was excited about, having some new toys in my home gym, and I wanted to do more and so forth. And I loved it, but it was, never going to work out. The other thing that has changed massively is during lockdown, I've absolutely binged through some box sets. So I tend to go through some box sets. Me and my wife will sit down of an evening. We'll have our kind of chill out time. We'll watch an episode of something, and then another episode, and then another episode, and then we go to bed late. And then once that box set is over, we'll then go through a period of saying, we need to get back into like a good bedtime routine and go to bed early. And we go through that phase. And then we get to the next box set and so forth. And so you kind of naturally will have these ebb and flow in when you feel great and feel ready to train and so forth. And there you go. And I realize that's the long story. But
that's great.
And anything that you can do to optimize the intensity of your workouts is probably good. So if that means reducing the volume, if that means reducing the frequency, if that means splitting the routine, if that means, going to bed earlier, training later in the day, so forth, then we've got to work with what we've got. So I think that's just life. So
yeah. Just conscious of time. I know we've run over, but just to qualify, I actually felt really bad this morning. I don't, you know what it is? I've been drinking this Four Sigmatic mushroom coffee that was a birthday gift, and I'm not sure if it agrees with me. Mushroom coffee, right. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it might not be that. It might be something else. But anyway, I had a workout after feeling quite bad, and I actually felt great after the workout. Do you ever do that? You kind of feel crappy. Yeah. You do the workout as a stress relief, or just to feel right. And just to qualify as well, even though I'm doing upper lower body split, my volume is still 10 exercises, but lots of neck grips in there, single joint tricep, so it's still usually big 5 kind of, or big, if it's just upper body, it's big 4, I suppose, with a lumbar thrown in as well. So, and then there's a plank. So yeah, I'm still doing, even if it's a lower body split, it's still 10 exercises. I'm still able to cope with that level of volume. James, this has been so much fun. This is actually been one of, I think, my favorite podcasts with you, and that's saying something. Best way people to contact you, find out more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, james.fisher@solent.ac.uk is my email address. So anybody can feel free to email me. I'll always get back to you when I can. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram, which is @jpfisheruk. But to be honest, I very, very infrequently use Twitter or Instagram. So you might be waiting a while for me to post anything of any significance. And find me on Facebook, and most people in this community will probably know me, or they'll be mutual friends. Just as a final thing to say, Lawrence, I have put something important on Facebook and Twitter this week. Last week we lost Dr. Ralph Carpinelli, who was
oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he passed away a week last Monday. I think it was the 3rd, and I've spoken with some of his family friends. And Ralph was just a phenomenal academic in strength training, probably a guy that most HIIT practitioners would know the name of because of some of his papers being very aligned with kind of a low volume, low frequency training approach. He had visited Arthur and Lake Helen in, I think, the 70s and 80s, and met Eldad and Jim Flanagan, and was a real big fan of Nautilus equipment. He was he was a very private person, kept himself to himself, so he wasn't known for speaking at conferences or on podcasts or so forth. But it's a real great loss to the community, to the academic community personally, because he challenged a lot of things the ACSM and the NSCA said. So, I think it's, worth just giving a shout out to him and to his family, who are obviously suffering with his loss right now. And, so sorry, I just wanted a platform to do that.
No, absolutely. Like I had no idea. That is really sad news. I think I've read some of his papers, but obviously I know the name, and I think I want to look back at emails, but I think I might have even had some communication with him to eventually come on the podcast. So that is really sad. And I'll try and figure out, well, maybe you can send these to me, James, if you have them. If you haven't, if you don't worry, but I'll find the best resource I can for his work, maybe ResearchGate and other places, and just link it up in the show notes.
If you go to ResearchGate, all of his work is still up there. Okay. It's all free to download. He published in open access journals, back in 2004 with Rob Barbotto, who I've spoke to recently. His stuff's up there, which challenged the 2004 ACSM progression models and resistance training guidelines. So, anybody who hasn't got Ralph's work should definitely get on ResearchGate and just download everything now. I'm sure it will stay available, but it's worth getting. If you can't get hold of it, send me an email, and I'm more than happy to share it. He would want people to read it, to digest it, to enjoy it. And it's got a tone to it. It's there's a reason that he wasn't one of the mainstream academics, because he, as I think somebody said to me, he wasn't going to drink the Kool-Aid. He was going to say it as it was. And I spoke with Stu Phillips about this, and Stu said, he often tried to get Ralph to calm down his tone a bit and become a bit more mainstream. When I suggested to Ralph about publishing together and doing some work with me, he said that I didn't want to do that because he was persona non grata. He wasn't accepted by the mainstream journals anymore, and if I published with him, I wouldn't be accepted either. So
oh wow!
He was just a phenomenal guy, and a real great loss, and a real inspiration to a lot of academics, because of what he stood for. His integrity is probably the key word that stands out. So yeah, people should definitely go and check out his work.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'm definitely late to learn that information. Did not know that. And to everyone listening to this podcast, to find the blog post to this episode, to get access to all the resources, James, if you could send me maybe the link to that paper about the that looked at loading the back and different ranges of flexion. Yeah, that will be linked up, and anything else we talked about. And then, of course, the resources by Dr. Ralph Carpinelli will be linked up as well. So to find that, please go to highintensitybusiness.com and search for episode 319. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.